Hello, 6th grade chronographers. That is, one who creates maps of time. This is your timeline tutorial. First, you will need all of your necessary materials. At the beginning of each unit in your textbook, you will find a list of dates to be used in your timeline. You will also need one piece of paper for your rough draft of your timeline, one piece of paper for math and spare notes, a ruler, and a pencil. I will be using this marker so that you can see very clearly what I will be writing. When beginning the math necessary for our timeline, we need to take the oldest date and the most recent date to determine the time span. When we are using the time frame of years ago, BCE, or even before present, then the oldest date will be the largest number. That means that the most recent date is, of course, the smallest number. For our current timeline, that means we subtract 500,000 from 13.7 billion years ago. As mentioned on Haiku, you will also need a calculator. At this point, we are going to enter in 13.7 billion years, and we are going to subtract 500,000 years. This will give us the very large number of 13,699,500,000 years. This number is the time span for our first timeline. In order to determine our scale, we must figure out how long our paper is. Normally, lined paper is about 10.5 inches. However, this lined paper is the same as a blank sheet of computer paper, that is 11 inches. Although you may use any lined paper for your rough draft, you must use a blank sheet of computer paper for your final draft. Therefore, in order to get our time scale, we will divide our time span by 11. That is 13,699,500,000 years divided by 11 inches, which gives us 1,245,409,090. If you would like to round off the 0.9 to 91, you may. As you can see, that number is our years per inch. You know that years per inch comes out to be your scale. And this is the scale for our first timeline. Okay, now I'm almost ready to begin making my timeline. First, I will want to make sure to include a legend for my timeline. I might do this at the beginning of creating the timeline, or I might wait until I have already listed everything I need on the page so that I know how much room in the bottom right corner I can use. For this time, I'm going to wait to put my legend until I know how much room I will need for my 3 timelines. When creating a timeline, you may measure from the top of the horizontally laid out piece of paper about 1.5 inches down. Luckily, on this page, that fits perfectly with the red margin. Not all timelines will have their line so high on the page, but we will need room below for this particular timeline. Therefore, our first line will be placed on the red margin. Line up your ruler evenly with each mark you have made. And create a straight line. Normally, you will place an arrow both at the left and right hand side of your timeline. That's because time continues to go further in the past and further into the future. However, since we are beginning this line with the beginning of time, we will not need to place an arrow on the left side. We will indeed place an arrow on the right side of this timeline. Once my timeline is drawn, I will most often place the oldest date in the list of dates to be used in the timeline on the far left-hand side of the page. That's because this date, in fact, is located here on the timeline. $13.7 billion years ago. Now I will want to place the label of that date. The label, as you can see, is the universe is created by the Big Bang. There is no problem with using shorthand and simply writing Big Bang. Now I'm well on my way to creating my first timeline. We must use our ruler to mark out each inch along the line. Be very careful that you are placing your marks exactly at the inch markers. Each of these markers is referred to as one hash mark. As you can see, we have 11 hash marks for the 11 inches on our page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 11 hash marks and 1 arrow. Now that our hash marks are laid out on our timeline, we can use our scale to figure out which year should be placed at each hash mark. Back with my calculator, I will enter 13.7 billion years ago. And I will subtract 1 time the scale that I have determined, because each inch on this timeline is my scale, or 1.245 billion years ago. So 13.7 billion years minus 1,245,409,090 years equals. Once I have this number, I will place it on the next hash mark. Now I continue subtracting my scale from each year. 12,454,590,910 minus 1,245,409,090 equals 11.21 billion years ago. As you can see, I decided to round this number since we had 209 million. Again, minus 1,245,409,090 equals 9.96 billion years ago. And I will continue subtracting the scale from each year, moving down my timeline. Since this is a rough draft, you may also begin to simply write billion as Bill years ago. However, on your final draft, you should write out the full word, billion. You may still use the acronym YA for years ago. This part of the timeline creation process can be very tedious. Simply stay positive, take a break if you need. And be sure to calculate accurately in order to come out with a good timeline. We're almost there. Last couple. And finally, this is a surefire way to know if you have subtracted accurately throughout your timeline. Between the last inch and the end of your page, should be only about the years in your scale. We have 1.245 billion years and 1.245 billion years. So when I subtract my scale, again, it almost comes out to 0. Now, normally, you will be even closer than 500,000. However, in this case, the last date in our time frame is 500,000. So we're only 10 years off. When we have longer numbers or labels, we may need to write sideways, like so. And here's the beginning of a great looking timeline. I have acquired a different color pen so that we don't get confused about our next step. Please know that while you are creating your rough draft, although I highly recommend using a pencil, you may use any method or writing utensil that you find best suited for you. Now, we have our hash marks, but these are not the same dates listed on our timeline. The dates necessary must be labeled and accurately placed. However, since we have labeled each inch and the year associated with it, we will find it much easier to determine exactly where each of our events lies. For instance, our first event, Big Bang, has already been labeled. Our second event, 13.2 billion years ago, shows the label of formation of the galaxies, such as our Milky Way. Now, our next hash mark is 12.5 billion years ago. If we want to be very accurate, which I highly recommend, we might take 13.7 minus 12.45, which gives us 1.25. We know there's about 1.25 billion years between each inch, hence our scale. 13.2 will come right around the middle of 13.7 and 12.45. So sometimes you can eyeball, and often you will not have as large numbers as we are dealing with on our first timeline. The blue mark I have made is in fact not a hash mark, but this is an event indicator. We have one event indicator at 13.7 billion years ago, and another here, which we will neatly label at 13.2 billion years ago. Since you can see the blue event indicator, I will use the black to make it more clear. And again, we must label the events on each date. Formation of the galaxies. All right. For my next event indicator, I don't have a date listed until 4.5 billion years ago. So I can go all the way down to 4.98 and see again that we are between 4.98 and 3.74 billion years ago. Without all of these hash marks at each inch, I would not know where to put my next event, which is the formation of our solar system. Similarly to before, 4.5 can be found around the middle of these two hash marks. Next, we start to get into more recent times, 3.8 billion years and 3.5 billion years and even 2 billion years ago. I think we can still fit at least one or two of these events on our large time frame. So I will go ahead and mark out where I think 3.8 billion years ago would be, and I can absolutely list my event above so as to not be crowded on one side of the line. And 3.8 billion years ago, we have our first life on Earth. $3.5 billion years ago will not go directly in the middle between 3.74 and 2.49, but it will be slightly closer to the 3.74 billion year ago hash mark. And that label is single cell organisms photosynthesize. Now that I'm getting into much closer time frames, I'm going to want to create a zoom in bracket. This is simple. I will take my pencil and mark out the area, which will now be created on an entirely new timeline below my large primary timeline. Since my next event is at 2 billion years, I need not go all the way to 2.49, but instead about midway, and I will go all the way to 500,000 years ago. As you can see, I have a very clear field goal-like shape, which I will draw a line down from very neatly, please, around all of your labels. And then I will open up this bracket into a new timeline. If you are afraid that you cannot draw a line neatly, please use your ruler. Remember that your rough draft does not need to be perfect, but your final draft should be extremely neat without overlapping lines or pencil eraser marks. But we're just on a rough draft, so that's okay. For the zoom in bracket, once I draw my line down Instead of a field goal, I will open up with a larger angle to my next timeline. Well done for your first part of timeline creation. Next time, we will create a timeline including our next events.